and walk down my stairs, into my kitchen, open my pantry, and take any kind of food I want to eat. I live in a world where education and water are necessities. But I'm a minority. I could have been born in places like Uganda, Bangladesh, or North Korea, where my life would be much different than it is today. Instead of seeing those nice cars drive by, I could be seeing the old, broken down, rusted cars on the side of the road, with the old, broken down, rusted people standing next to them, asking, how did my life end up like this? Instead of having all the food at my disposal, I could be scrounging like a mouse for every last crumb that I get to eat at night. So how can this be fair? How can some people be treated so much better than others? How can people who have the same blood, who have the same ethics, mothers, fathers, children, be treated so vastly different? These questions led me to an overall thought. What really are human rights, and what constitutes as a human right? There are double standards seen today within our community and our society about the equal treatment of people around the world and poverty. We can see in developing nations that the poverty level is so much higher than that of ours in the developed nations. The treatment of women, the treatment of children, and the treatment of soldiers and prisoners are also a main concern that arise when talking about how people are treated all over the world. To paraphrase T.K. Kumar, in Sierra Leone, a country located in a highly conflict-ridden region, was one of the most brutal humanitarian crises that the world has ever witnessed. The sheer scale of loss of human life and the nature of brutality shocked the world. So to get a little more insight into how people are treated, I have a short video to show you of a young man's named Shin. He was born and raised in a North Korean labor camp, and he's actually the main character of the book that I read throughout the semester. Sorry, I don't have the speakers plugged in.
I was born in a political prison camp in North Korea. I was expected to just do manual labor and to work, and I had no concept. I had no rights. I had no concept of what human rights were. I was destined to live and die in this prison camp.
So this video shows that the level of corruption and the level of control that people in other parts of the world have is so much different than that of what we experience in our lives. The difference between that of, let's say, North Korea and that of Canada or the US is astounding. So here's a collage that I've made that highlights the differences between the way we live and the way other people around the world live. So as you can see on the right-hand side, we're used to luxuries. We're used to our nice cars, the amount of food that we can't even imagine that we wouldn't have, and the houses that we're used to living in. You can see on the left-hand side, the top of the screen, how 50 to 100 men would sleep each night on nothing but wood boards. You can see down in the bottom left-hand corner that people would be exposed to hard labor for 16, 17, 20-hour days, whether it was blazing heat or sheer cold. In Sierra Leone, for example, a study conducted by the University of South Carolina concluded that an astounding 76.6% of women reported either being raped or sexually abused at some point in their lives. Now, this is quite important because it shows not only that this is happening, but that people are aware that it's happening and we don't do anything about it. We turn a blind eye and we think that nothing's wrong. According to UNICEF, 22,000 children die each day due to poverty. And, quote, they die quietly in some of the poorest villages on earth, far removed from the scrutiny and the conscience of the real world. So this has been a lot of talk about negative talk about things that, frankly, we don't even know that's happening in other countries. We don't know that these countries have these problems. In my opinion, our society today is very conceited. We care a lot more about ourselves than we do about others. So take a look at these pictures that I've put together and just think to yourself, what do each of these have in common? When I look at these pictures, I see that these are all luxuries that we're used to having. We do not need to get a new phone every 2 years just because a new version comes out. We don't need to buy the most expensive and flashiest jewelry just to show that we can. What we do need to do is what we do need to do is we need to start thinking about what we have here that we take for granted that people in other parts of the world don't have. So you may be asking yourself, where am I going with all this? I want to make the point extremely clear that the rights and privileges that people all over the world have differ immensely. We're supposed to be living in the same world, under the same sun, but why are people treated so much differently? This is where the concept of basic human rights come into play. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was declared on December 10, 1948, in the Palais de Charleroi in Paris. On this declaration, there are 30 rights that everyone, regardless of where you live, who you are, what your situation is, are entitled to have. These consist of the right to life, liberty, and security of person, the right to nationality, the right to freedom of movement of residence, and maybe the most well-known right, the right to freedom of expression and opinion. Human rights enable people to have a concrete feeling of worthiness, as they know that wherever they go, they will always have these rights that are for them. So throughout this semester, I've read a great book by the name of Escape from Camp 14 by Blair Hardin. This book dives deeply into the whole theme of human rights and the violations that occur when people are mistreated. This novel exemplifies how a young boy named Shin, who we saw, has lived his entire life and grown up in a North Korean labor camp under the complete control of the North Korean government for his entire life. In Shin's case, he was stripped of his right to live a free life without servitude by being controlled every day and by doing whatever his government wanted him to do. Relating to the question of how are human rights defined, I feel that when Shin was not able to live his childhood without servitude, the rights that he was rightfully entitled to were taken from him. Also, within this small community that Shin lived, there was a lot of segregation that occurred between that of the prisoners, the soldiers, and the North Korean government. I would like to read you a small passage from the novel that I think best exemplifies how rights are taken away from people in this camp. So the teacher sprang a surprise search. He rifled through Shin's pockets and those of the 40 other 6-year-olds in his class. When it was over, the teacher held 5 kernels of corn. They all belonged to a girl who was short, slight, and, as Shin remembers, exceptionally pretty. He doesn't recall the girl's name, but everything else about the school day in June 1989 stands out in his memory. The teacher was in a bad mood as he began searching pockets. When he found corn, he erupted. "You bitch! You stole corn? You want your hands cut off?" He ordered the girl to the front of the class and told her to kneel. Swinging his long wooden pointer, he struck her on the head again and again. As Shin and his classmates watched in silence, lumps puffed up on her skull. Blood leaked from her nose. She toppled over onto the concrete floor. Shin and several other classmates picked her up and dragged her to a pig farm not far from the school. Later that night, she died. So, as you can see, this passage shows that the Koreans have no respect for the rights and the privileges of people within this camp, and that they think they can get away with whatever they want. The amount of segregation that is seen through this novel astounds me. Another good story that I read throughout this semester that relates to segregation is a short story called The Garden Party. This story highlights the divide between the high class and the low class societies still living within the same community. This novel is about how a high family has this elaborate, huge garden party on the same day that the father of the poor family passes away. This story highlights how, even though the father passes away, the rich family doesn't have the respect or the decency to cancel their own party. Instead, they try and compensate for his death by sending them a food basket. The lack of human rights that the rich family puts on the poor family is an example of how segregation within a community can lead to and cause human rights violations. So many people think that the answer to poverty and the answer to human rights is for us as developed nations to send our goods and services to those less fortunate countries to help them get back on their feet. In my opinion, and based on the research I've done, I feel that this is not the right approach and the right steps needed to be taken in order to maintain their survival. By using this approach of supplying goods and services, I feel this is only going to be a band-aid solution for a much bigger problem. Using an analogy of fishing, we can say that we don't just give the other countries our fish, but we teach them that the skills and tools necessary for their own survival. But nothing in this world is one-sided. Everybody wants something for themselves. So how can this approach affect both parties involved? I'll tell you how. If we teach instead of give, we will not only be saving our country money, but we will also be helping them by giving them the tools to sustain their own lives. By teaching the skills necessary for them to maintain their own survival, we will benefit by not having to spend as much money on these goods that we're sending, and as I said, helping them by teaching them not to depend on us for their lives. This mentality of teach instead of give can be used for all types of resolutions to help ensure that human rights are enforced nationally and even globally. By empowering third world individuals to stand up for themselves, and by giving them the tools necessary to sustain their own lives, the rights that were once taken from them will soon be regained to them. When others see that the people who were once the poorest of the poor, the dirtiest of the dirty, the lowest of the low, start standing back up on their own 2 feet, it will motivate others to do the same, and hopefully repel those that were trying to keep them down. Throughout my inquiry and my research, I've been trying to come up with a true definition of what human rights really means. I don't just want a list. I don't just want a definition off the internet that nobody can understand. My purpose is to inform us all of something that not a lot of people have much insight into. Throughout this TED Talk, I hope I've given you a clear idea of what human rights are truly about. Based on what I have researched, I've come up with my own definition of what a human right is. A human right is not a privilege. A human right is something that we cannot take for granted. A human right is a fundamental law that everyone, regardless of race, color, religion, where you live, social status, anything, are entitled to. Rights are the ability for each person to be treated equally under any circumstance. After concluding my research, I've come to the conclusion that there are 5 main commandments, if you will, of human rights that I think everyone are entitled to. These are my human rights. 1, the right to education. 2, the right to fresh drinking water. 3, the right to freedom of slavery. 4, the right to make our own life choices. And 5, the right to health care. Hopefully that throughout this talk, you've come to the same conclusion that I have about what human rights really means. But if not, hey, that's fine. Human rights are very open for discussion and are a very interpretive topic. But you have to remember that the one main point is that human rights have to be given equally to everyone, no matter what. Live your life to the fullest, knowing that you now always have these rights available to you if you ever need to fall back on them.